The Spanish-American War was one of the most consequential conflicts of its time. Yet, despite being relatively unknown to many, it fundamentally reshaped the world. It marked the end of the Spanish Empire and firmly established the United States as a global power. Many historians fail to grasp just how significant this war was, because the world as we know it today might have been completely different without it. Why? Because this war changed the way America saw itself. It was the first time the U.S. tested its strength on the global stage, and it discovered just how powerful it really was. In fact, you could argue that without this conflict, the United States might never have played the same role in World War II. Why? Because the Spanish-American War breathed new life into the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine, first declared in 1823, was essentially a warning. Europe, stay out of the Americas. But for most of the 19th century, it was little more than a statement of intent, words with no real power behind them. That changed in 1898. With the defeat of Spain, the United States proved it could actually enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It was no longer just an idea. Decades later, during World War II, the Monroe Doctrine was reinvoked and adapted. This time, it wasn't about blocking European colonialism. It was about blocking the Axis. It became the justification for U.S. actions to counter Nazi, fascist, and Japanese influence in the Western Hemisphere. And it didn't stop there. The precedent set by this war paved the way for America's future interventions. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, conflicts that would define global politics for decades. But even if we imagine a world where the U.S. never changed course because of this war, history would still look completely different. Because it wasn't just about America. Without the Spanish-American War, Spain might never have collapsed into civil war decades later. And without the Spanish Civil War, the Nazis, Soviets, and fascist Italy would have lost their most crucial testing ground for the weapons and strategies that would later set Europe ablaze. So yes, this small, almost forgotten war may have shaped the entire 20th century, but what made it so extraordinary? Why did it erupt in the first place? And how did such a brief conflict leave such an outsized mark on history? But before we answer all these questions, let's begin with some context. By the end of the 19th century, Spain was a shadow of its former self. Once the most powerful empire on earth, it now clung desperately to a handful of colonies: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. But these weren't just exotic possessions. They were the last fragments of a vanished imperial glory. And it was in Cuba where the empire faced its greatest test. For decades, Cubans had risen in rebellion against Spanish rule. The 1895 uprising, led by figures like José Martí, Máximo Gómez, and Antonio Maceo, was not just another revolt. This time, the fight for independence burned hotter, more organized, and impossible to ignore. But Cuba was not only a Spanish problem. For the United States, the island was a strategic and economic obsession. Its sugar plantations, its trade routes, and its location just 150 kilometers from Florida made Cuba look less like a colony of Spain and more like America's natural backyard. And under the lens of the Monroe Doctrine, Washington considered any lingering European presence in the Caribbean a direct threat. Spain responded with brutality. General Valeriano Weyler unleashed the infamous reconcentration policy, forcing rural populations into camps to cut off support for the rebels. The result? Starvation, disease, and the death of hundreds of thousands of civilians. American newspapers quickly branded him the butcher. And here enters the media. Yellow journalism, led by tycoons like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, flooded American readers with sensationalist headlines. Atrocities were exaggerated, images were dramatized, and Spain was painted as a barbaric oppressor. Public opinion in the U.S. turned ferociously against Madrid. Diplomatic relations deteriorated further when, in 1898, the infamous Delome letter was leaked. Written by the Spanish ambassador in Washington, it described President William McKinley as weak and spineless. For the American public, it was the ultimate insult, and by this point, the powder keg was set. All it needed was a spark, and that spark came on the night of February 15th, 1898, when the American battleship USS Maine suddenly exploded in Havana Harbor. The blast ripped the vessel apart and killed 269 U.S. sailors. The cause was uncertain, but the consequences were immediate. American newspapers rushed to accuse Spain. The New York Journal and the New York World printed sensational headlines claiming Madrid had planted a mine. In the streets, a new slogan was shouted, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." But behind the fury, doubts remained. The U.S. Navy's inquiry concluded it was an external explosion. Spain insisted it had been an internal accident. And decades later, in 1976, Admiral Hyman Rickover's study suggested the most plausible cause was a coal bunker fire that ignited the ship's magazines. Still, the debate has never been fully settled. What mattered in 1898 was not the truth, but the perception. American public opinion demanded war. President William McKinley, who had desperately tried to avoid conflict, now faced enormous pressure. From businessmen who feared losing investments in Cuba, from a media establishment that cried out for vengeance, and from politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, who saw in war an opportunity for expansion and glory. McKinley delivered an ultimatum. Spain must withdraw from Cuba. Madrid refused to grant independence. The United States responded with a naval blockade. On April 23, 1898, Spain declared war on Washington. 2 days later, the U.S. reciprocated. The Spanish-American War had begun. But was this just a war for Cuba? Number, it was something far bigger, because almost overnight, the conflict spread across two oceans. In the Caribbean, the fighting would decide the fate of Cuba and Puerto Rico. For the United States, it was about more than independence for Cuba. It was about enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, proving that no European power would ever again dominate the Americas. But while the world's attention fixed on Havana, another front was opening half a world away. In the Pacific, American warships set their sights on the Philippines and Guam. These islands weren't just distant colonies. They were strategic gateways to Asia, outposts to project power into China, into the Pacific trade routes, into the very future of global commerce itself. But before the fighting began, one question loomed large. Who actually held the advantage? On paper, the United States had become an industrial giant. By the late 1890s, its economy was already massive, about 14 times larger than Spain's. That wealth fueled a modern navy built of steel and heavy guns, supported by superior logistics. It allowed the U.S. to mobilize troops quickly, enforce naval blockades, and sustain operations far from home. Even across the globe, American forces benefited from enthusiastic volunteers, patriotic fervor, and support from Cuban and Filipino insurgents who knew the terrain. Spain, meanwhile, was fighting with the remnants of a bygone age. Its navy relied on outdated vessels, many wooden and armed with obsolete artillery. Its finances were drained, logistics strained, and soldiers were often conscripts sent unwillingly to fight in distant colonies. Yes, they had combat experience and knowledge of local terrain, but morale was fragile and resources were scarce. With such an uneven balance of power, the outcome was almost inevitable. In the Caribbean, the U.S. quickly established dominance. By April 1898, the U.S. Navy blockaded Havana and Santiago, trapping Admiral Cervera's fleet and cutting off Spanish supplies. By June, American forces secured Guantanamo Bay, guaranteeing supply lines and a foothold in Cuba. Clashes soon erupted at Las Guasimas and more decisively at San Juan Heights, El Caney, and Kettle Hill, where American troops, including the Rough Riders and Buffalo Soldiers, stormed Spanish trenches with Gatling guns and sheer determination. capturing key positions. 2 days later, on July 3rd, the naval battle of Santiago annihilated Cervera's trapped fleet, leaving the Spanish in the Caribbean powerless. By July 17th, Santiago surrendered, and soon after, Puerto Rico was secured in under 3 weeks with minimal resistance. Half a world away, the Pacific theater showed the same imbalance. On May 1st, 1898, Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic fleet destroyed Admiral Montojo's outdated squadron at Manila Bay with negligible U.S. losses. Guam fell in June without a fight, and by August 13th, Manila was captured after a staged battle designed to preserve Spanish honor, leaving Filipino rebels excluded from the surrender. Spain, defeated across 2 oceans, faced a stark reality. Its centuries-old empire had crumbled before American power. The only way to formally end the conflict without total humiliation was through diplomatic negotiation. In December 1898, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris. Madrid negotiated to preserve some dignity, while Washington pressed for full cession of Spain's remaining colonies. Under the treaty, Spain relinquished control of Cuba, though it technically became independent under U.S. oversight. Puerto Rico and Guam were formally ceded to the United States, stripping Spain of its last footholds in the Caribbean and Pacific. The Philippines, the crown jewel of Spain's Pacific Empire, were also ceded to the United States for a sum of $20 million, a gesture meant to soften the blow. Other former Spanish territories in the Pacific, no longer under Madrid's control, were sold to Germany in 1899, further erasing Spain's colonial presence across the oceans. The Treaty of Paris ended the Spanish-American War, but its consequences would ripple across continents. For Spain, defeat was a bitter reckoning. Its overseas empire was gone, leaving the nation to confront a political and economic crisis. Yet, amid the turmoil, some modernization began, as Spain struggled to rebuild and redefine itself in a world that had moved on without it. For the United States, victory marked the rise of a new global power. No longer confined to the continent, America now commanded strategic territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific, projecting influence far beyond its borders. But this new reach came with immediate challenges. In the Philippines, tensions erupted into the Philippine-American War, a brutal conflict that would last from 1899 to 1902. Cuba gained formal independence, but under the Platt Amendment, the United States reserved the right to intervene, ensuring that Havana remained within Washington's sphere of influence. Puerto Rico, meanwhile, became a U.S. territory, its people navigating a new political status that tied their fate directly to American rule. The Spanish-American War, brief though it was, had redrawn the map of the world. Empires fell, new powers emerged, and the stage was set for the United States to assert itself as a global player. But now, it's your turn. What do you think? Was this a crucial war? Did it truly change the world forever? And how might history look if it had never happened? Leave a comment below. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Don't forget that here at Histopedia, we upload new videos every week, so make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and activate the bell so you don't miss them. We hope to see you again soon.